Hello and welcome to the Career Instinct podcast with me, Matty Taylor, as I learn how to navigate life and careers in the 21st century. My guest today is James Wand. In the first of this two-part series, James will talk to us about his career trajectory so far in the civil service, as well as the challenges he has come up against in his job. We ready to go?
Now or never.
Okay. Hi James, how are you doing today?
I'm not too bad, Carrie. I'm very happy to be your first official guest.
I am so excited to have you as my first official guest. Thank you so much.
To your soon-to-be millions of listeners, I'm sure.
Yeah, billions. Come on, gotta aim for the stars.
Total domination.
Indeed, what can we say? It will be the only thing on the airwaves within a month.
Well, we'll all be getting our Spotify 2020 Wrapped, and if this isn't on like people's top sort of podcast, then we would have failed. So high ambitions.
High ambitions indeed. I actually got my 2020 Spotify roundup early in December, which I thought was a bit premature. Haven't even started listening to the Christmas tunes yet. But
No, I got mine as well. Maybe that's why they do it, because they know you'll have Christmas tunes. But it was quite sad really, because it turns out I'm in the top 2% of Taylor Swift listeners worldwide.
That's amazing.
So it's me and 16-year-old girls. But then you think Taylor Swift's been around 10 years, so it can't just be 16-year-olds. They would have been 6. So it must be other people in their mid-20s, one hopes.
Definitely. I definitely think like the music most people listen to is from like their childhood or their good times.
Yeah.
So I hear word on the street you've recently started a new job, James.
So, well, I haven't started just yet. I have got a new job coming up at the beginning of January.
Okay.
So for context, I currently work in NHS Test and Trace, and the new job will be still within the bubble of the civil service. Yes, it will be in the Land Registry. And the reason purely for my moving was that if you take something like NHS Test and Trace, it did something the civil service hadn't done before in my mind. It stood up at pace, essentially like a whole new department. If you talk about its size and its scope. And I was there pretty much for the launch. And 6 months in, after we set up this whole business, which is essentially the size of Asda, this department, how many people we employ, after doing all of that, and in my role as sort of the private secretary to the person who's in charge of tracing, that's sort of their job, I thought, I've kind of done my sort of length of service in a way. And I think the only reason it takes on this sort of militaristic tone, I think it's because it's working in coronavirus, but I think this often happens with lots of jobs, where when you're working on really difficult things, whether it's to do with emergencies or whether it's to do with short-term, really pressured things. So I think it happens in the Brexit sphere as well. And so you have the terms like mobilisation, task force, those sort of words are used, and I think that encourages them people to reflect on their own sort of service as sort of acts of duty and lengths of service in the same way the military does. Obviously, I'm not comparing the two, but I think it obviously encourages you to sort of reflect on your own experiences in the same way. So I basically just came to the conclusion, like after 6 months of working, like occasionally like 10, 11-hour days, that it just wasn't for me, and that I wanted a little bit more of my weekend back, and that I'd been there for the party, and the party was going full swing. And there's so many TV shows that should be cancelled when they're in like a good season and not on a bad season, and so I wanted to leave on the good season.
So I think Test and Trace has definitely had a lot of media attention recently. So what was your role as a private secretary to the Trace part of Test and Trace?
Say it when you've had a few glasses of wine. I dare you. So we dealt with all the briefings for our directors. So they were one below the overall chief exec of Test and Trace. And as I say, they looked after all of tracing, and then all of the demands that came in from Secretary of State, a lot of the media requests that came in thick and fast. And obviously lots of the day-to-day smooth operations. So actually, often in these larger departments, and I think it's the same in any large business, there's actually quite a small set of people or small set of groups that really push an organization forward and actually set the sort of strategic sort of trajectory.
Yep.
And so that was really what we were doing, and that went everything from what commercial frameworks we were doing to how we envisaged the organisation being, because of course you don't want it just to be a flash in the pan, you want it to be around for years and years to come. And so it's a good role for anybody that's got the energy and the time,
Yeah.
and also likes a little bit of everything. I've always found that myself, I'm somebody who can never pinpoint down what they want to do. I like a little bit of project delivery, a little bit of policy, a little bit of knowing about how commercials and HR and finance work and everything like that. And so it's a great for giving that exposure and being really close to senior people.
Yeah.
And then there's also the other element that you don't want to burn out, and these jobs do attract burnout.
Yeah.
I mean, the only other thing I would say, there's some great articles out there about, especially in terms of the civil service, is that there seems to be an idea that if you want to do well in the civil service, you have to do sort of 18-month stint, this sort of active service, if we're using the army terms, or line of duty, in order to go to that senior civil service level. And I don't think that's necessarily true. And I think that's kind of based on an archaic way of thinking and working. But in some echelons of the civil service, it still sort of rings true. But no, it's a really great for the exposure and really great for learning about how large organisations work. But at the end of the day, everybody's in charge of their own destiny. You have to recognise when it's time to move on.
Yeah. So I guess my question from that is, obviously working in test and trace, and like you say, having exposure to senior people, having a really varied job sounds really great and something that a lot of people would want from a job. But day to day, did you find it interesting and stimulating, or what did you find yourself preoccupied with doing?
I think a lot of the job I found preoccupied with the stuff that was essentially blockages that other people needed to unblock. And so therefore, if you weren't in the right headspace on a bad day, you could feel like you were dealing with the rubbish that nobody else wanted to deal with.
Right, yeah, that makes
And
sense.
that is never a good place to be in, either mentally or productivity wise, because you don't want to just be dealing with everybody else's sort of cast often leftovers and stuff that they found too difficult, because that means essentially you're just setting yourself in terribly sort of difficult tasks for the whole of your career, which is not very fair. And also, it's not a good place to be mentally. You want to be part of the team and doing your bit. And also, everybody talks about your sort of added value. And if you're always sort of picking up the crumbs that everybody else can't be bothered to deal with, and it's harder for you to sort of add your added value.
Sure.
So on a day-to-day level, I think although I did enjoy it and it's fantastic exposure, it can feel at times quite isolating because you are just working so hard to overcome really sort of major blockages, whether that's sort of functional in terms of HR, commercial, or sign off or something like that, or whether it's in terms of relationships and the politics of an organization you work in.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting having to problem solve and get around blockages. I find can actually be super draining. So I can imagine that, referring to what you were saying earlier about burnout, if you're in a job where you're just constantly problem solving, it will easily lead to burnout because it takes so much mental strength to like muster up to like, oh my God, now I've got to sit down and get over this problem.
Yeah, and it doesn't really fit our idea, especially when you're sort of young or you're just graduated. It doesn't fit the idea like we often feed ourselves or we're often fed on what we expect a job to be like. And it goes back to the same thing that everybody listening to this podcast will know, is that if you pick up a job description, you read it, and then you're like, oh, but what's everything else I'm really going to be doing?
100%.
And I think there's this illusion actually about what you actually end up doing isn't always what you're sort of told about or what's brought up front.
100%.
And so, like, if you think about, like, everybody thinks when they want to be they want to be like a chef, or they want to work in food or cook, or influenced by things like Nigella or, Great British Bake Off or something like that. And that sparks their sort of interest, which is great. But then you realise there's actually so much more day-to-day blockages and hurdles and nuances. And some of those things are just a fact of life, like having to make your bed is a fact of life, and it's a daily blockage to, giving yourself 10 more minutes.
Yeah.
But some of them are actually just an inconvenience that if you can live without and you're not very interested in the first place, do spur you to look elsewhere for that sort of job satisfaction.
Yeah, for sure. No, and it's so true. And I remember reading a book, and I think it's called The Subtle Art of Not Giving Up by Mark Manson.
I think I know a couple of people who have who read that. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of truth to that actually. And, don't take yourself too seriously, because out of work, there is also that thing that, you know, when you leave the office and we go back to your group of friends, your family, we are not just who we are at work. We are many actors in life. And so when you leave the office, you are, you know, people don't really care that much about your job. I mean, people care. You can chat about work outside of work, but you don't need to be as formal. And it doesn't really matter how important you are when you're talking to your kids or to your partner or whatever. So
yeah, for sure. So 2 points. I think firstly, what you were saying earlier about the problem side of things, the point that Mark makes in his book is that you've got to find a job which involves problems you enjoy solving, because jobs and life is all about solving problems. And I thought that changed the way I kind of looked at how I choose a job. I thought that was really interesting. But I think you pick up on a really interesting point, which leads me on to your next job as well, which is this work-life balance and the importance of having a work-life balance and recognizing that sometimes your job isn't the be all and end all.
this is going to sound very philosophical, but we have many jobs in life. So the job you go out and get paid, the job you go out and get paid to do is basically just, if we're looking at it from a very, very like philosophical lens, it's basically just the paid labor you get to do by your employer.
Yeah.
But you come home and you might be a parent or a mother too, or you might be like a house dad, or you know what I mean? That there are other jobs and other roles that you fulfill.
Yeah.
And by having a little bit of like social time, you do get to explore those in much more sort of greater depth. And so it isn't about social time for the sake of social time, or social time so you can just sit down and do nothing. It's social time so you can enrich your life in other ways, which you may end up then in a completely different job direction. So if you go out there and you do a master's, you end up, your job prospects completely change. But social life, I think it's just important finding the things you truly love and truly don't love, and remembering you're sort of more than just a two-dimensional figure.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so the land registry.
The land registry, I know.
Tell me all about the land registry and why you've plumped for the land.
So it employs 6,000 people across 14 locations. So it's a bit ahead of the civil service trend. There's obviously a push to move the civil service out of the southeast and out of London, which I think is good, because I think often there's a little bit of a London/southeast working pattern, which is slightly out of kilter with the rest of the UK. You know, people often commute longer to work in London. They often stay longer at work. Obviously, you do get a little bit of London waiting to reflect that, but I don't think it's often very good for things like mental health. So the organisation is spread all around the country, and its main simple purpose is actually just to, sounds like I'm just avoiding a question, it's to just register land. And so the idea is that when you buy land, when you change the status of land, so whether it's going from like woodland to nature reserve, or building estate to nature reserve, or whatever, that is registered to avoid things like fraud. So the same reason you register your car is to avoid fraud and as a symbol of ownership and to give some protection. And then it's also, because it's been around for so long, it's now also become a little bit of a directory of what the UK's land looks like in terms of our land use.
So what does it look like?
It depends which way you want to look at it. It has a register for 87% of the land, so it can tell you about land use, who owns it, what the purpose of it is. It's a very good tool for looking at, if you compare it with other sort of things that the Geospatial Commission does in the Cabinet Office in terms of the geography of land and the census. I suppose you could get a really rich picture of how the physical landscape, as well as the sort of ownership landscape and population landscape of the UK has changed. So I think it has that sort of wider cultural benefit, as well as obviously the day-to-day practical benefit, because obviously when everybody applies for a mortgage, they have to make sure the deeds for the property are correct and things like that, and that's where the land registry comes in.
So the land registry also manages like physical properties as well as nature land.
Every property will be registered with the land registry. So your house, my house, everybody's house will have the deeds, and those deeds, you have a copy of the deeds, and the land registry will also have a copy of the deeds. Whenever you buy and sell it, the deeds change.
So James, what is your role within the land registry, or will you find out in January?
So I'm going to be senior policy coordinator.
Gosh, nice title.
A part of that is because the land registry owns its own policy. So how could we, a lot of that is improving the user experience. And a lot of that is about saying, actually, how can we, as an organisation, make it more convenient for people to register with us and use all the services that we have a legal obligation to deliver?
Sure.
A part of it as well is to work with other government departments. Say actually else is happening around government that we either need to be aware of because we'll be impacted, or we need to hook into because we need to impact other people. And so a lot of what we do is with the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government to say, if you're changing land use, or what is your strategy for how we're going to use our land, Homes England, all those sort of agencies, we need to be hooked into sort of their ideas and their strategies. But it's also looking at across like the government, and I think even across the wider private sector, so actually what technologies are you using in your sort of land monitoring space? And what I mean by that is that the land register, yes, it's a sort of an online directory of who owns which land, but you have to measure that, and that's why the Geospatial Commission comes in. That's where the whole mapping system comes in. I was reading on their website, the smallest piece of land that's ever been registered was actually just a single tree in the middle of a farmer's field.
What? Why?
Because the tree was designated as a nature reserve. It's a very old tree, and so it's actually owned by somebody who didn't own the rest of the field. So there's these sort of nuances that you need a system that's compatible and user friendly and accessible for everybody.
Yeah.
That works in those sort of situations. So it's quite an interesting one. I think it has a little bit of stigma for being a little bit of a weird, nuanced department, but I think sometimes to get the best experience, just go for the weird and the nuanced.
So what best experience does the weird and nuanced give you?
You can specialise and be a jack of all trades. So obviously, I discussed about in DHSC, my role was quite rigid. And so I was a bit of a jack of all trades as a private secretary. You do a lot, you're expected to know a lot. I think if you're in a more nuanced or a bit more of a wacky sort of group or department, you are exposed to so much more whilst also getting specialised in actually what your job is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also people, especially when you're young, you have these grand ideas of what you're going to work in, and before you know it, you actually realise that like organisations like the Land Registry actually exist, and actually they serve a really useful purpose. If they're a smaller organisation, sometimes you get to know the team much better.
Yeah.
And yes, it's great to be working on those really critical, really important projects, but equally, it's so good to just step away and be able to work at something for a few months or a few years that has a lasting impact. It might not be super sexy, but like it's really going to have sort of a lasting, tangible change to how people work. Keep an eye out for those unusual sort of places that aren't often on your radar, or say, yeah, actually that might be for me, because it might have some really useful avenues for me to explore. And also then you can create your own identity. You're not going where there's going to be like 30,000 other people working. You're going where there's a much smaller workforce, so you can actually just be your sort of perhaps your true self.
Yeah, for sure. But I think it's really great advice for our listeners, that kind of trade-off between, do you want to be a small fish in a big pond, for example, or do you want to be a small fish in maybe
Medium-sized pond.
The medium-sized pond that's not very well known. Yeah, no, exactly. But I think it's something that actually you have to really consider what you want from your career and who you are as a person, and what your preferred ways of working are. And that can definitely influence those decisions.
Yeah, and we know people who have gone to large organisations, and especially in London, there are multinational corporations like knocking on the door of graduates from all universities who want to just reap them up and suck them up, and also non-graduates as well. You have to make that sort of conscientious decision about what your priorities are. And you can really easily end up being sucked into something which is either too big or too overwhelming or just not up your street. And so it's also about, I think, taking time and assessing what you're really after. And play in the field and just seeing what's out there. There is no prize at the end of the day for staying somewhere that you're not having fun.
Definitely. Your 20s is totally for just exploring and seeing what your options are and what you want to do. Like, there's no point committing yourself to anything at the moment. And we're fortunate where we don't have any obligations, nothing to tie us down as such. Like, we don't have a mortgage yet or a family, so now it's definitely the opportunity to try this stuff out.
I mean, this is it, the joys of the housing market at the moment for the foreseeable future means that the prospect of having an actual mortgage is probably, for most of us, still a little bit of a distant dream. So we have that few years to experiment a little bit more.
Yeah, it's true. But one thing that we were when we caught up yesterday about your job as well, And one thing I think is very important to bear in mind when you are considering a job is not just the job itself, but the convenience of the job and how it fits in with your lifestyle. So, for example, you're living in London at the moment, right? But the job is a 40-minute commute out to Croydon.
Yeah, so I mean, for any listeners who are from Croydon, that is also London. I don't want to
Thanks. I
accidentally
thought it was in
offend.
Surrey.
Oh, maybe it is. Maybe it's like better to say it's Surrey then.
I don't know.
Whichever way people want
Surrey,
to swing it.
London,
Um,
Surrey.
I've always sort of said I don't want to be traveling more than an hour. So I started my first job out of uni, and it was a 90-minute commute each way. So I was spending
90
3 hours.
minutes.
I mean, it's great because I mean, it used all my energy up, so I wasn't spending much money going out or doing anything.
It's not
But
what you want though.
isn't it, it just comes to that point where if you're spending sort of 3 hours on a day on a train or on a bus,
Yeah.
that if you put that in perspective, you're only at work for 8 hours a day.
Yeah.
There's an imbalance there as well, and I think this is why you have to think about things like mobility, and if you are going to have children, and this is like lots of dilemmas I think people get in life. Is
Hmm.
this job right for me right now as well? Like, do I have the energy to do it? Is it close enough to my home?
Yeah.
Does this fit with like my lifestyle?
Yeah.
So they're all big sort of things, and I've always said to myself, I don't want to spend most of my time on a train, wondering why it's only going at 2 miles an hour.
Yeah.
Uh, I mean, that's my personal, and it just sounds a little bit selfish sometimes when you then check off a checklist and you say, I want a good paying job. I don't want it to be too far away. I want it to be interesting. I want it to be fun, and I want it to be challenging. Those jobs, I think, A, are out there, and I think B, historically, I think it's very easy to say that's sort of a really selfish line to take, but lots of people have managed to find that in the past. And I think if you look to our parents, hopefully a lot of them managed to find those sort of jobs, and so
Yeah,
it shouldn't be unattainable for our generation either. And
definitely.
so, all because something's difficult or it's not fashionable, don't worry about that, because I think, again, in your 20s, it's your chance to really tick those things off the list and sort of assemble and get everything sort of in the right place.
Yeah. So James, what is on your list?
My 5-year plans, you mean?
Well,
Was
okay,
it
yeah. Tell us about your
I
5-year
was going to say, was it
plan.
Stalin who had the 5-year plans, or did he have 10-year plans? I can't remember my A-level Russian very
Yeah.
well.
No, I think it
Um,
was 5 years. I think Mao had them too.
Obviously, the two people you want to be compared to.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I do obviously want to succeed, and I'm ambitious, and obviously, it's really good
Yeah.
to rise up the levels, not necessarily in the same department, but in the same bubble.
Yeah.
Whether that's, so for example, if you're working at BP, you can move across to Shell and then back to BP and then move across Texaco, or you can move across to all the branches there are of sort of the oil business. And it's the same in the civil service. You can move from department relatively easily,
Yeah.
much to the criticism of many of our ministers, um, who dislike the
Wow.
fact that civil service moves so quickly and they lose the institutional knowledge.
Yeah.
But you can move across, you can get that experience. And to me, it's not about being at the top very quickly. I mean, I am slightly competitive, and I think it's not bad to be competitive. It's also about
Mm-hmm.
realizing that as long as you're earning a wage that makes you happy,
Mm-hmm.
as long as you're happy in your job, take your time to get there. So my 5-year plan is, look, embed myself the junior grades, which I think I've successfully done. Move into those sort of middle grades. That can
Mm-hmm.
be a really long process, and I think that can you need to start thinking of it sometimes in terms of decades. Don't run before you can walk.
Seriously, decades.
Yeah, I mean, not like decades, like 3 decades, but I think, if you
Yeah,
are talking about like three pay bands in the civil service, I think if you're looking to go up in your pay, say 10, 15, 20 grand, and you're not working like a large corporation like law company or something like that, then that's not going
sure.
to happen in a couple of years. Like, you're going to have to think, oh, what's my idea for 5 years' time? What's my idea for 10 years' time? So I suppose what I'm trying to say is, like, think realistically.
So, sorry, just to pause on that. So when you say like move up a job group, you're basically meaning like that would be a promotion. And how
Yeah.
long, okay, and how long would it be between you getting a promotion generally?
This changes for like everybody. I mean,
Okay,
and it depends what your motivations are. If you want to go to the top really quickly, you're willing to put in
sure.
the effort, then I think you can reach a natural peak. And then after that peak, it becomes difficult because people recognize sometimes that you are young, or that you don't necessarily have the experience what other people have.
Right.
If you want to do like a gentle curve, and I think that's obviously what most people do in life, if they take on new challenges and new chunks, and they take another bite of the pie when they think they have the opportunity.
Yeah.
And people do that at differing speeds, but I think, again, most people fall into that sort of very broad middle range.
Yeah.
And there's lots of people who say, actually, I want to do this job, and like, I'm not motivated by promotion, or I don't want a new challenge in life, or actually, I'm a full-time parent and I just do this job because it fits my sort of 9 to 5 schedule.
Yeah.
Promotion in and of itself shouldn't be your sort of necessarily your ambition. It should, you should try and take things, I think, at your own level, or if you are ambitious, then go for it. But I think you need to see the whole sort of ecosystem of motivations.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good answer. And I think it is really good. It's a really good idea to kind of be realistic about these things, because I think a lot of the time, if you're doing well at school and you're doing well at uni, you expect that speed of development will just continue into your career. And actually, I think a lot of people I know anyway have found it quite a hard reality to face, when a lot of the reasons you get promoted are because you have like 10 years experience behind you, and it's quite hard to adapt to being like, to think I did a degree in 3 years and now I have to wait 10 years to get to middle management, for example.
When there isn't like a definite outcome, makes things difficult as well. Like 3 years, you know that if you stick and you do okay, you're going to come out with X result, or you might come out with X result.
Yeah.
But I think work is so much more difficult because there isn't that sort of finite, you do your 5 years and you get your promotion. And so, it is more difficult. It just takes time and patience. And I totally get where people are coming from when they say, actually, I'm just eager to move on to my next thing because I've done my 2 or 3 year stint and I'm just done with sort of the same old.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's a real big debate within like the job sphere. It's like, how much do you reward people who've been around a long time, and how much do you reward people who have been sort of ambitious or been successful in the short term? It's a difficult one to play. I'm like, I don't think there's ever going to be an answer to that. I mean, this is a debate that I feel like been going on now for like a few decades, and probably will rumble on long after I retire. So,
indeed, after your multiple 5-year plans.
Well, this is it. It's like, I think 5-year plans don't have to be I mean, now I'm just giving life advice rather than career advice.
No, this is perfect. This is what we need.
Like 5-year plans are more just about, what do you want to do in the 5 years? Like, do you want to spend this 5 years, yes, having a job that's like, is relatively safe, but allows you to go and do other hobbies.
Yeah.
Other people might say, actually, I've had a really rough 5 years at work, so my next 5 years is going to be finding a job which literally has job security. And I think there's also about where do you like physically want to be. There's so many ideas at play in these little 5-year plans that before you know it, you probably racked up about 40 years worth of ideas.
Yeah, it's true. But James, I'm interested, and I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer or play the devil's advocate here, but what happens if things go wrong? Like, how do you cope when things go wrong?
If things go wrong in your 5-year plan, I know this is probably not what you were referring to, but just to link it, there are several ways. If things go wrong in your 5-year plan, it's your 5-year plan. It's nobody else's, and unless you're like you've got a big chart, but like when you do a project delivery plan or something, you have the chart, you have the red line that's moving through it. Unless you have one of those, there's really nothing to worry about.
Yeah.
If things go wrong in the workplace, I think this is what comes over time. You need inner confidence, and I don't mean a cockiness, but I do mean inner confidence. So if anything does happen at work that's inappropriate or challenging, so you can say, actually, I'm not comfortable with that. Again, a really, really silly example, really, but I think it sort of makes a point. I'm going to say my good friend Nigella Lawson, but she's not a good friend because I've never met her in my
life. My soon-to-be great friend Nigella Lawson.
I've just been watching her TV show a lot, but her best advice about when she was working that is, I wish I said no more often, and I wish I actually had said, I'm sorry, I can't do that. And often that's inconvenient for people. It's not inconvenient for you, though. I mean, people will have to deal with no. And I feel if you say yes and yes and yes to things, you end up with spinning 1,000 plates, none of them particularly being spun very well or very quick. and you're a bit like, what am I doing this for? To say no, if you sometimes you have to speak up when there's a challenge, sometimes say no when there's a challenge, and then sometimes you do have to just deal with challenge. If this is an instruction or a direction or a piece of it that I just have to do, but I'm not finding it interesting or I'm just being challenged, then you do have to sort of stay calm, think back to sort of the basics of, while you're doing that job, to reassure yourself, and then reach out and say, actually, I've got this excellent network of teams around me that can obviously help me. Hopefully you'll also have a good manager that's there to assist you. So I think challenge comes in many different formats, and you need to respond in many different ways, but always respond with confidence and conviction, because there is people often will tell you there's like a wrong way of doing things and the right way of doing things, but I don't think there is. There's like a careful way, and then there's like a knee-jerk way, and perhaps neither are the right response. You don't want to jump into situations, but you don't want to be too careful either. So I just think if you confidently decide on your sort of direction of travel in a challenging situation, just go with it.
Okay, but how do you say no? How would you say no? Because that can be difficult.
Sometimes I'm always one of those people who's paranoid about whether I have a right to say no.
Yeah.
So at work, I often get people feed me work, and it comes in all different directions. And sometimes I think this isn't for me. They're just giving it to somebody who they know.
Okay. Yeah.
Who works in that general sort of space of like, oh, James, do a briefing on this.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I'm like, but I'm not the expert. So it's not about me being obstructive. I actually really want to help.
Yeah.
But you need to go to the expert to get the expert answer. And so sometimes I need to turn around and say, I'm really sorry. Either you're not being clear enough about what you need from me,
mm-hmm.
or I'm not the right person. I can give you this information, but it's just like a bit of a no from me. And sometimes I go to my manager.
It's a no from me.
but I do go to my manager sometimes and I say, like, I'm really sorry, but I'm also, don't say sorry so much, but like I do say, like, I'm just really finding it difficult to identify what I need to do and what my actual task is here, because this doesn't look like something my skill set is.
And
or
I
like
think,
actually go on.
No. I was just going to say, and I think even being able to say that requires an inner confidence to know yourself and know what your strong points are, and know when, say, your workload is too much, so you have to say no to things, or when your expertise isn't enough and you have to say no to things. And that, I think, comes back to what you were saying about that inner confidence as well.
Yeah, because like the inner confidence is also about, everybody thinks you end up a bit like the I forgot, Miranda out of Devil Wears Prada, is you end up with this sort of bossy boots. But actually, when it comes to things like your welfare and your well-being and things like that, you really need that inner confidence, but at the end of the day, you are the person who know how you're feeling, and you don't want to feel like and if you're feeling you're doing something not because you want to do it, but because you feel like you have to, it doesn't make for a very productive or positive sort of workforce.
Yeah.
And so sometimes being a little bit challenging, or saying no, or being constructive, or however niche or whatever way of saying it that suits you best, makes sort of a positive difference.
Yeah, definitely. But it is something that needs to be practiced, because I think we're not used to saying no. Like our school, our education, we always have to be yes people. But I think saying no and knowing when to say no, or knowing how to say no, is definitely a really useful skill. I call it a skill, like a little soft skill that you need to build for sure.
I think it is a skill. And I mean, as much as you say no, though, obviously you should learn to say yes, because you have to live within the realms of reality, and often there's going to be moments in your job where somebody tells you to do something, and
Like,
it's
oh
going to be a
God,
boring
no,
job.
not me.
Like, I used to have a job. Well, I used to be like assistant private secretary back in HMRC, and part of my job was to get my director's lunch.
What?
And like,
Seriously?
I mean, like, yeah, it was just to
What?
buy, buy her
so
lunch. She used to tell me what she wanted from wasabi.
Really? Every day?
That wasn't just my job. I did other things.
No,
Like 3 days a
but
week.
she'd
Yeah,
come over to you, to your desk, and be like, James, I really want the katsu curry from Wasabi. Go get it for me.
I wasn't even saying I'm going on my lunch break. She'd just come over and she's like, oh, it's lunchtime. Like, here's my card.
Oh my God.
I do fancy a katsu curry. Or sometimes she'd go on the menu. And then I'd have to remember it because I'm not a big fan of sushi. So I'd have to like remember the name.
Okay, so we've spoken about how you deal with challenges. Now I want to know how you deal with disaster, when something goes wrong.
But luckily, I've obviously in Test and Trace, it's such a big organisation that I've listened in on, and I think every organisation has these, but I'm going to pretend like you don't know what they mean just for the sake of it.
Yeah.
Bridge calls. So you have a situation where like part of your technology goes down, it collapses, or whatever it is. Imagine it's like
Sure.
Internet Explorer's down. The
Okay.
people at Microsoft will have a call in place to assess what's happened, how are we fixing it, what the comms are going to be, who needs to know, like how serious is it, all of those sort of main questions.
Mhm.
And in those situations, so I mean, from watching those, I've gained a real sense of, first of all, staying really calm. Because
Okay.
most of the time in a crisis or a disaster even, I can't fix the whole disaster.
Yeah.
If it's a tiny little hole in the Titanic, I can put some chewing gum over it. But if it's a rip in the side,
Yeah.
it's gonna need more than me and a box of Tic Tacs, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I often think, first of all, stay calm and
Mhm.
know who you need to fix it. So ask the key
Yeah.
questions. What is the problem? How big is the problem? What do we need to fix the problem? Because you might not know all the answers, and that's fine. Lots of people know little bits of the answers. So if you combine their knowledge with your knowledge, you have the full jigsaw. Then you're able to actually really calmly do it. I mean, it can be really difficult at times because nobody wants to be there at 11 o'clock at night,
Oh
very
gosh,
calmly answering
no.
questions.
Yes. What is the
So
problem? Let me go through my
so
checklist.
of course, in certain situations, you're like, I need to know a little bit quicker. But I
Yeah.
think in most disaster situations, you are going to be surrounded by people who know the answer.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think this is very sage advice for our listeners, is just like keep calm. I think doing things in the moment often, I found from experience, makes things worse. So indeed, if you can take a step back to firstly calmly understand what the problem is, and then seek the people with the right expertise, then you will ensure that you don't make what is a disaster a worse disaster. Okay, so we've spoken a bit about your last two jobs, but often the advice that we're told at school or uni, for example, is that you have to find a job, stay in it for at least 2 years, because that will look good on your CV. Now,
Mm-hmm.
James, you are a walking case of the exact opposite of that advice, and
Yes.
you seem to
So,
be doing pretty well.
so since I graduated in 2017, I won't say job, I'll say role, because some of the roles have been in like the same organization. So this is my seventh role I've had.
Seventh
Seventh,
in
seventh,
3 years.
3 years or 3.5
Wow.
years.
Sorry. Sorry.
Some of
3.5.
those were like specifically short-term ones. I get why that advice is given out by universities, because I think there's a temptation to see a job that you do straight out of university as a little bit of an extension of your education, especially with graduate schemes, whereby you are not just doing a job, but you're then becoming an expert in that field. But I think the makeup of the job industry nowadays is that there are just not that many, there are not as many perhaps expert fields as we like to think. So, for example, if you
Yeah.
go into policy in a certain area straight out of university, let's say you do go into the civil service and you work in like home office policy, those key skills you learn there are going to be really useful at applying it to a different type of policy in a
Yeah.
different space. Or if you go and work in a really big retailer, not to name names, but let's say you go and work for like John Lewis, the skills you learn as a buyer there, you'll be able to apply those to M&S too. So
Yeah.
I don't think sticking in one institution or one company for too long is always very useful. I mean, having said that, of course, like we are always encouraged to do things like grad schemes, which I do think are incredibly useful, and they do sort of give you that firm footing. But I don't think they're like a silver bullet to all the answers about having a job. And what I mean by that is that I think sometimes there's this sort of real desire to get a grad scheme, and then you're like, yes, I've got job security, and it's going to be the most amazing thing. And yes, it's really good for job security, but outside of that, the quality of them often differs quite greatly.
Yes.
So you can have a really good
100%.
grad scheme, and so like it often then depends on the organisation, and then you think to yourself, well, actually, would I have just been better at getting sort of an entry level normal job?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting consideration that people have to bear in mind, is between the do you go for the graduate scheme, or do you, and potentially like do your 2-3 years on the graduate scheme, then roll off and climb up the ladder, or do you find an organization where you can just start climbing the ladder straight away?
It's true, and There's so many things at play, right? So you join an organisation that has a grad scheme, and then some of them really reward that. So obviously I'm not on it, but I'm thinking about the civil service grad scheme, which does essentially reward you after your 3 years of service by giving you quite a nice, safer position. But then you think, what have you done in return for that? And so often you do hear lots of people who are on grad schemes bemoaning the fact, and I think this is perfectly right thing to say, I'm actually doing something which is way above what I'm being paid to do, and I wish I could just do it all the time. But sometimes you can't escape either, and you get dragged away from something you really like doing unless you're in a fortunate position where you can jump ship.
Yeah, no, it's true. Now, it sounds like you've had a bad experience with a grad scheme.
I didn't have a bad experience actually at all. So I joined the local government grad scheme after uni, and I went to Walthamstow. It was actually a really nice neck of the woods, and the people there were lovely, but my heart just wasn't in it.
Aw, why?
I wanted to join the civil service, which is probably because both my mum works in the civil service in an administrative role, and alternatively, my dad works in a local council, so maybe I should have been attracted to the local authority sort of route. But anyway, I just knew that my heart wasn't in it, and the thing that I was working on, after a year doing it, I was just a bit downbeat. So I thought, no, let's move on to something else. So that scheme was good, and it had lots of benefits, and I got good exposure, and it did give me that step in to working life, but it just didn't feel right for me. And then I got onto the civil service fast stream, but then I didn't take it.
Why?
Because I had this horrible thing that I was going to be shipped off out of London to go and work in the MOT in the middle of like Scotland or something,
Yeah, and that was not part of your 5-year plan.
And that was not part of my 5-year plan. And so I actually thought to myself, actually, is this something I want to do? Or am I doing it because I think it's what I should be doing? Like, is it something I want to do that will make me happy? Or is it something which I think I should be doing? And I just moved to London at this point, and I was just a bit sort of unsure. And I thought to myself, well, if I'm unsure now, if I get into it and I'm not having fun, it's just going to feel really bad.
Yeah.
So absolutely not.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think now you're working in the civil service, you've been able to jump around some really interesting roles. We also have friends, don't we, who work in the civil service but aren't on the grad scheme, and they seem to have just as good opportunities as people on the fast stream. And so I think if you can get onto the fast stream, great, that's amazing, but there are also definitely other opportunities for you to flourish within the civil service.
Yeah, it's very difficult, because I think this goes back to how you need to do your research into the grad scheme, because if this grad scheme has really fixed sort of every 6 months you will move from placement to placement, and if you can go into even detail about what your placements will be in, and that's obviously really great, and that shows that they really planned. But if it's a grad scheme where actually you're just going to go in there and it's a little bit unclear about what you'll actually be doing, then sometimes it's worth saying, actually, I'm not too sure about this. It doesn't feel like it's going to give me the structure, which ironically people, and myself included, when applying to grad schemes was kind of the thing they wanted.
So
I think sometimes in that respect grad schemes can be quite self-defeating.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Career Instinct podcast. In the next episode, we'll talk to James about his love of politics and how that has influenced his life at school and university. As a social sciences student at Cambridge, James will share insights into the Cambridge application process and life at the uni, so tune in to find out more. Also, make sure to click subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest episodes and guests. To get in touch, you'll find us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram under the handle The Career Instinct Podcast. Until next time, everybody.